We just want to know what happened and why our baby didn't come home.
For things happened in this case in the last 72 hours, and only one of them was expected. The FBI put its involvement on the record, in writing, in full, for the first time since this story began. A young woman who has been the center of this case's biggest unanswered question finally spoke. Not through a cousin's Facebook post, not through a friend relaying secondhand gossip, but face-to-face, across a table, with the mother of the boy she was the last confirmed person to speak to. Somewhere in this story, a family got a threat. A real one. Serious enough that federal agents are now involved in stopping it. And tomorrow morning, an 18-year-old who should be starting his second year of college is going to be buried, and the whole country will be able to watch it happen live. We're going to walk through all four of those things tonight, carefully and in order, because in a case that has already been damaged once by rumors mistaken for facts, the way we tell this story matters almost as much as what we're telling you. I'm going to show you exactly where every claim comes from, what's confirmed, and what still isn't. Stay with me to the end, because the most important detail in this entire update, the one that actually reframes what everyone thought they knew about Nolan's last conversation, doesn't show up until the middle. This is the Nolan Wells case. Here's what we know as of tonight. Before we get into what's new, let's ground ourselves in what this case actually is, because it's easy, especially after 16 days of headlines, to lose track of the fact that at the center of all of it is a real 18-year-old named Nolan Wells. Nolan disappeared during a trip to Horn Island, off the Mississippi coast, in early July. What began as a search for a missing teenager turned, in the days that followed, into a body recovery, and then into something far larger, a fractured, contested, and increasingly public investigation into exactly what happened to him in the hours before he vanished. In the 2.5 weeks since, this case has moved through nearly every phase a story like this can move through. There was the initial disappearance. There was the search. There was the recovery of his body and the devastating confirmation that this was no longer a missing persons case. And then there was the part that has defined this story ever since. A widening gap between the account given by the friends who were with Nolan that day and a family who has said, plainly and repeatedly, that the story they've been given does not add up. That gap is why this case looks the way it does right now. Why there are 2 separate autopsies underway instead of one. Why the family has brought on their own independent investigators rather than relying solely on local law enforcement. And why, as we'll get into tonight, the FBI is now involved at all. It's worth naming the emotional terrain here too, because this isn't an abstract mystery for the people living through it. This is a mother and father who, at the exact same time they are pushing for answers about how their son died, have had to plan his funeral. Grief and investigation are usually sequential in most families' experience of loss. First you grieve, then, if something feels wrong, you start asking questions. For the Wells family, both have been happening simultaneously, in public, for over 2 weeks. That context matters for everything that follows tonight, including the news that just broke. For most of this case, the question of why the FBI was involved at all had only ever been answered in scraps. A phrase attributed to an unnamed source here. A single line in a local report there. Nothing official, nothing complete. Which, if you've been following along, is exactly the kind of vacuum that's caused problems in this story before. This week, that changed. The FBI's Jackson Field office issued a full, on-the-record public statement addressing its role directly. I want to walk through what it actually says, because the specific wording matters more than the headline. The statement makes 3 things clear. First, that the FBI has been assisting with certain aspects of this investigation, specifically using federal tools and partnerships not readily available to a county sheriff's department. Second, that despite that assistance, the Jackson County Sheriff's Office remains, in the Bureau's own words, the lead agency, and will continue to lead the investigation from here forward. And third, that the FBI's support has been ongoing since early in the process, aimed at helping investigators find answers for Nolan's family and for the wider community that's been consumed by this story. Now, here's why the tone of that statement is almost as important as its content. This isn't a press release announcing a breakthrough. It isn't an escalation notice. It reads like something else entirely, a deliberate, carefully worded attempt to lower the temperature around a question that had been quietly generating real anxiety for days. Somebody at that field office understood that unexplained federal involvement was doing more damage circulating as a mystery than it would do explained in plain language, and they made a choice to close that gap in writing instead of letting speculation keep filling it. And that speculation had genuinely taken off. Some of it treated FBI involvement as proof this case had been secretly escalated into something far more serious than the public had been told. Some of it went the opposite direction entirely, painting federal agents as having stepped in not to investigate, but to manage the story, to contain it, maybe even to help someone avoid accountability. Neither of those theories holds up against what the Bureau actually put in writing. What they confirmed is real, meaningful support, expertise, tools, partnership, running alongside a Jackson County investigation that remains firmly in the driver's seat from start to finish. Support, not command. That's a distinction worth carrying with you through the rest of this case, because it's going to keep coming up. It's also worth sitting for a second on why this clarification took so long to arrive. Federal agencies are, as a rule, extremely reluctant to comment publicly on active investigations. Silence is usually their default position, almost regardless of the case. So the fact that the Bureau broke from that default here, chose to put out a complete, on-record statement instead of simply declining to comment, tells you something. It tells you they recognized that the ambiguity itself had become a problem. In a case this saturated with speculation, silence doesn't read as neutral. It reads as confirmation of whatever theory is loudest that week. Choosing to speak, even in careful, measured language, was itself a decision with consequences, and it's one worth giving credit for, even as we stay clear-eyed about exactly what that statement does and doesn't actually tell us. Because buried inside that same statement is the real reason federal resources got pulled into this case in the first place, and it has nothing directly to do with Nolan's death. According to the Bureau's own language, its efforts have been specifically focused on interstate threats received by individuals connected to this case, and that this work is running in parallel to the family's independent investigation, not merged into it. Read that again, because it reframes a lot of what people have assumed about why the FBI is here. This isn't about reopening or re-examining how Nolan died. It's about protecting people connected to this story from threats serious enough to cross state lines and become a federal matter in their own right. Let's unpack that phrase, interstate threats, because it's doing a lot of quiet work in that sentence. For a threat to legally qualify as interstate, and therefore fall under federal jurisdiction, it generally means someone in one state sent something threatening to someone in another state, using a channel that inherently crosses those lines. A phone call, a piece of mail, and overwhelmingly today, the internet. That's precisely the kind of case the FBI is built to handle, regardless of how large or small the underlying story is. It doesn't require Nolan's death itself to be treated as a federal matter. It only requires that somebody, somewhere, used an interstate channel to threaten somebody else connected to this case. And here's the part that matters just as much. The Bureau's statement does not specify what those threats said or who specifically received them. Outside reporting covering this same statement has noted plainly that it remains unclear exactly what kind of threats were made or who was on the receiving end. That gap is important because separate, unofficial reporting has circulated much more specific and frankly disturbing claims about the content of threats sent to at least one family connected to this case, tied to one of the boys who was on the boat with Nolan that day. Those specific details have not been confirmed by any official statement. Not from the FBI, not from Jackson County, not from anyone with the actual authority to verify them. I want to be precise here, because this is exactly the kind of moment where a case like this gets damaged by good intentions moving too fast. We know, officially, that interstate threats occurred, and that federal resources are actively addressing them. We do not have official confirmation of the specific content of those threats, or exactly who received them. Both of those things are true at the same time, and it's important not to blur them together into one tidier, more dramatic story. There's actually a reason official statements tend to stay vague on precisely this kind of detail, even when the underlying facts are serious. Naming specific victims, or repeating the exact language of a threat, in an official public statement can itself cause additional harm, drawing more attention to the very people an investigation is trying to protect, and potentially compromising whatever legal action might eventually be brought against whoever sent them. That restraint, even though it leaves us with less detail than we might want, is very often a deliberate protective choice, not an attempt to minimize what happened. If the FBI statement is the development that clarifies why federal agents are involved, this next one is the development that actually reshapes the emotional and investigative core of this case. And I'd argue it's the most important thing that's happened in this story in over a week. Katie, the young woman Nolan spoke with in what remain his last confirmed minutes on that beach, has finally been heard from directly, not through a relative's Facebook post, not through a family friend relaying something they heard secondhand, through an actual in-person meeting with Nolan's own mother, Christine. According to Christine, the two of them sat down together, face to face. And Christine has said plainly that what Katie told her does not match the story that's been circulating everywhere else. Stop and register how significant that shift actually is, because up until this point, everything attributed to Katie in this case had arrived through intermediaries. First, it was a family friend, relaying what they'd heard from someone else. Then it was Katie's own mother and sister, posting publicly to correct rumors that had already spiraled out of control online. Each of those accounts was filtered, understandably, through someone else's memory of what Katie had said, rather than coming directly from the one person who actually has firsthand knowledge of what Nolan said and did in his final confirmed minutes. A face-to-face conversation between Katie and Christine changes that completely. As far as we know, this is the first time information about that final conversation has traveled directly from the person who lived it to the person who needs to understand it most, without anyone else standing in between as a filter. Now here's where I need you to slow down with me, because the actual content of what Katie said is more specific and more limited than a lot of the public conversation around this case has made it sound. According to Christine, Katie's account has actually been consistent from the very beginning. She and Nolan met that day. They spent time together, and at some point, they parted ways. Katie then got back on a boat with her own friends, a different boat than Nolan's group. Based on their conversation, she assumed Nolan was heading back to rejoin his own friends. Here is the detail that matters more than almost anything else in this entire case right now. Katie never actually saw Nolan get on that boat. She assumed it, based on what he told her. She did not personally witness him rejoining his friends. Sit with that distinction for a second, because it changes the shape of the central contradiction in this whole story. This isn't a direct eyewitness clash. It's not Katie having seen one specific thing happen while the friends claim something different happened in the exact same moment. It's closer to this. Nolan told her his intention. Whether he actually followed through on that intention before whatever happened next is something that nobody, not Katie, not the friends, not the family, can currently confirm firsthand. An honest assumption based on a real conversation and a claim that Nolan chose to stay behind aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. Both could technically be true at different moments, if something changed in the gap between that conversation and whatever came after it. I think it's worth asking, honestly, why this nuance got flattened so fast in a lot of the public coverage of this case. The answer isn't complicated. A clean contradiction, one witness says this, another witness says that, makes for a much more compelling, much more shareable story than an account built around a reasonable, good faith assumption. But Katie's actual position, as relayed by Christine, is far more measured than she says one thing, they say another. She isn't claiming she watched Nolan walk away from her and physically board a specific boat. She's saying he told her his plan, and she had every reason at the time to believe he'd follow through on it. That is a meaningfully different kind of account than a flat, direct contradiction, and it deserves to be treated as such, rather than collapsed into the same category of testimony. This also reframes, at least partially, what actually still needs to be explained. If Katie's account holds up, the real open question isn't really whether Nolan wanted to leave the beach that day. It's what happened in the gap between him stating that intention out loud to Katie and whatever came next, a gap that, as of tonight, nobody has been able to fully account for. That gap is now, more than any single other detail, the actual center of this case. We touched on this earlier when we broke down the FBI's statement, but it deserves its own space, because separate from that statement, more specific reporting has emerged describing an actual threat received by a family connected to this case, specific enough in its described content that it would fall squarely within the category the FBI's statement was addressing. I want to handle this part of the story with real care, and for the exact reason we just laid out. The FBI has confirmed that threats occurred and that federal resources are actively working to address them. It has not officially confirmed the specific content of any single threat, and it has not named who received it. Some outside reporting has attributed detailed, disturbing threats to a specific family connected to one of the boys who was on the boat with Nolan that day. Until that specific reporting is confirmed by an official source, the responsible way to treat it is as credible but unverified, real enough to take seriously, specific enough that it shouldn't be casually repeated online as settled fact. Here's what is not in dispute and doesn't require any additional confirmation to say plainly. Whoever is sending threats to anyone connected to this case, regardless of what they personally believe happened to Nolan, regardless of how certain they feel, is committing a serious federal crime. Grief, suspicion, and public pressure do not grant anyone permission to threaten a teenager, a parent, a judge, or anyone else standing anywhere near this story. That's true no matter whose name ultimately attaches to which specific threat. It's worth thinking, too, about the broader chilling effect something like this has on a case like this one. Every witness in this story, every friend, every family member, every young woman who happened to spend a few minutes talking to Nolan on a beach, is watching this unfold in real time, in public, with their name potentially just one bad Reddit thread away from being attached to a threat investigation. If coming forward, or simply being publicly named, carries the risk of drawing threats serious enough to involve federal agents, that creates a real disincentive for anyone else who might otherwise be willing to speak up with information that could actually help this investigation move forward. Protecting people from that kind of retaliation isn't just basic decency. It's directly tied to whether this case can get the full cooperation it actually needs to reach an answer. This is a distinction we keep coming back to on this channel, and I want to explain plainly why it matters so much in this specific case. Every person connected to this story, teenagers among them, is having their name and their reputation shaped by every single detail that gets repeated publicly, whether or not that detail has actually been confirmed. The FBI's own statement is deliberately careful and vague about specifics, almost certainly for exactly this reason, to address a genuine, serious problem, interstate threats, without turning the statement itself into a tool that further identifies or exposes anyone connected to this case. That same restraint is worth matching in how any of us talk about this case publicly, including here. There's a broader principle worth naming directly, because it applies to almost every high-attention case, not just this one. In stories that generate this much public interest, there's a constant pull toward filling every gap with the most specific, most dramatic version of events available, whether or not that version has actually been verified. A vague official statement about threats can, in less careful hands, quietly become a detailed account naming a specific victim and repeating specific violent language. That kind of embellishment doesn't just risk being factually wrong. It risks compounding the exact harm the original threat was meant to cause, by keeping a family's name and their fears circulating publicly long after the initial threat itself. Being careful about this isn't about downplaying what happened to that family. It's about making sure we're not becoming another link in the chain that keeps spreading the harm. Stepping back from the threat specifically, let's ground ourselves in where the actual, formal investigation sits right now, because there's a lot happening simultaneously, and it's easy to lose track. Following a July 15th meeting between Nolan's parents and Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers-Rath, Attorney Ben Crump confirmed that this case will be referred to a grand jury once the underlying investigation concludes. Crump has also confirmed that Nolan's phone will undergo a coordinated review, the family's own independent investigators examining it alongside law enforcement's separate examination, with both sides seeing what the other finds. Sheriff John Ledbetter has been direct about what his office believes it owes this family, saying plainly that the Wells family deserves a thorough, factual investigation, and that's exactly what his department intends to deliver. Meanwhile, the state autopsy, conducted the Tuesday after Nolan's body was recovered, remains pending. The independent autopsy, conducted separately in Washington, D.C., hasn't produced results either. It's genuinely worth pausing to count how many separate processes are running at the exact same time here, because it's easy to lose track of them individually. There's the sheriff's department's own investigation. There's the district attorney's office, now coordinating directly with the family toward an eventual grand jury referral. There's the family's own independent investigation, staffed with former law enforcement and federal agents. There's the state autopsy. There's the independent autopsy. And now there's a coordinated review of Nolan's phone, involving both sides. Each of those has its own timeline, its own team of experts, and its own standard for what counts as confirmed. Keeping all of them straight, and not assuming a development in one automatically means something for the others, is a big part of what makes this case genuinely difficult to follow accurately. And it's exactly the kind of thing that produces bad information when people don't slow down. That grand jury referral, by the way, has not been received as unambiguous good news by everyone following this case. Former Mississippi Judge Carlos Moore has publicly raised concerns about District Attorney Myers Rath specifically, pointing to what he describes as her office's history in a separate, unrelated case involving a fatal police shooting, one where, in his account, overwhelming evidence still failed to produce an indictment. Moore has argued that a grand jury referral by itself shouldn't be mistaken for progress, and has said he intends to keep watching this case closely to make sure it doesn't quietly stall the way he believes that earlier case did. A different attorney, Tyler Bailey, has offered a more measured read on the same development, explaining that a grand jury referral is actually standard, routine procedure in this county for any death classified as unnatural or suspicious, not, by itself, proof that foul play has been confirmed or even strongly suspected by investigators. I think both of those perspectives are worth holding at the same time, rather than picking one and discarding the other. More skepticism comes from real, specific history with this particular prosecutor's office. Bailey's explanation comes from how these referrals typically function as a matter of ordinary process, regardless of the specific case. It's entirely possible for a grand jury referral to be standard procedure and for this specific DA's track record to still deserve close, continued attention. The real test isn't the referral itself. It's what actually happens once a grand jury receives whatever evidence this investigation ultimately produces. Before we move to tomorrow, it's worth briefly revisiting two claims that spread widely earlier in this case, because both of them shaped public belief before anyone had actually verified either one. And getting them right matters for how carefully we should be reading everything else in this update. The first was a photograph that appeared to show Nolan at a pool party. Many people took it as proof he'd been alive after the 4th of July. That claim was checked against the photo's own metadata and against an account from Nolan's friend Trocken Shepard, and it was determined the photo was actually taken on June 27th, a full week before Nolan ever set foot on Horn Island. The second was a viral video many people believed had captured Nolan in an argument shortly before he disappeared. Shepard has confirmed, repeatedly and directly, that the voice on that recording is his own, not Nolan's. Both of those corrections trace back to the exact same underlying pattern that we keep encountering in this case. In the vacuum created by two still pending autopsies, unverified claims have consistently outpaced confirmed facts. That pattern is worth keeping in mind with every single new detail in this case, including everything we've just walked through tonight. Confirmed information and secondhand claims can look almost identical at first glance. The only reliable way to tell them apart is to keep asking, every single time, exactly where a given detail actually came from. As all of this continues to unfold, Nolan's family is now less than 24 hours away from doing something no parent should ever have to do. The funeral is set for tomorrow, Monday, July 20th, at Centerpoint Church in Ocean Springs, with visitation from 9 to 11 a.m. and the service beginning immediately after. Reverend Al Sharpton is set to officiate. There's a detail here that hasn't gotten much attention, and I think it deserves to be included. The commission overseeing the Mississippi Coast Coliseum and Convention Center actually voted unanimously to offer their venue for this service, free of charge. The family ultimately chose Centerpoint Church instead, and the Coliseum responded with genuine grace, releasing a statement saying they fully support the family's decision and remain committed to supporting them and the broader community through this difficult time. That exchange, a public venue offering itself, being respectfully declined, and then responding with warmth rather than any hint of offense, says something about the broader community response to this case that's easy to overlook amid everything else happening around it. This isn't just a family fighting an investigation in isolation. This is a family being actively supported in very concrete, practical ways by institutions and individuals who never knew Nolan personally, but who have clearly been moved by his story. For anyone unable to attend in person, organizers have announced the entire funeral will be live-streamed, both online and on YouTube, meaning people following this case from anywhere in the country will be able to witness the service as it happens. That's worth sitting with for a moment, because a funeral is, in almost every ordinary circumstance, one of the most private, most intimate rituals a family goes through, a closed circle of grief, shared only with the people who actually knew the person being buried. Tomorrow's service is going to be the opposite of that. It will be broadcast live, watched by an audience that has spent over 2 weeks debating GPS data, contested witness accounts, and viral videos. Now invited to witness the actual human cost behind everything they've been following. That's an enormous, almost unprecedented level of public exposure for what should be a family's private grief. As coverage of tomorrow unfolds, it's worth remembering that what's being live-streamed is a real funeral for a real 18-year-old, not simply the next episode of an ongoing story. I think it's worth naming plainly what this funeral represents in the context of everything we've covered tonight. This is a family that has spent the past 16 days fighting publicly and relentlessly for answers about how their son died, while simultaneously being forced to plan his funeral in full public view. Tomorrow, those two threads collide directly. The same press that has covered every twist in this investigation will be present for a service that Christine has described, in her own words, as designed to celebrate who Nolan actually was, rather than to dwell in the suspicion and grief that have otherwise defined this story for over 2 weeks. There's something worth sitting with about the timing of everything we've covered tonight, arriving in these final hours before Nolan is actually laid to rest. The FBI statement, Katie's account, the threat reporting, all of it landed in the last 72 hours before this funeral, which means the Wells family will walk into tomorrow morning carrying every one of these open threads with them, unresolved. They will stand in that church, celebrating their son's life, while a grand jury referral sits somewhere in the future, while 2 autopsies remain unfinished, while a contradiction about his final conversation remains genuinely unsettled, and while, according to reporting that still hasn't been officially confirmed, a threat investigation continues quietly in the background. Grief, in this case, has never gotten the chance to exist entirely on its own, separate from everything else swirling around it. Tomorrow won't change that, even as it gives this family a few hours explicitly set aside to try. The FBI has now put its role in this case on the record, in full, confirming real assistance with the investigation, specifically tied to addressing interstate threats made against people connected to this story, while making unmistakably clear that Jackson County remains firmly in the lead. Katie, the young woman at the center of this case's central contradiction, has finally spoken directly, meeting face-to-face with Nolan's own mother, and confirming an account that is more nuanced than much of the public conversation has suggested. An assumption about Nolan's stated intentions, not a first-hand confirmation of what actually happened after they parted ways. Reporting, still not officially confirmed in its specific details, describes a family connected to this case receiving threats serious enough to be part of exactly what that FBI statement was addressing. And tomorrow, Nolan Wells will be laid to rest, in a service his family has deliberately built around celebration rather than sorrow, live-streamed for anyone who wants to be there, without physically being there. Nolan Wells was 18 years old. 2 autopsies still haven't told his family how he died. A grand jury is waiting somewhere down the road. And in the meantime, this case keeps generating exactly the kind of pain, threats, hostility, public suspicion that everyone connected to it never expected to become a target of: his friends, a young woman who simply spoke with him on a beach, and now, according to reporting, a whole family. There's a broader shape to this update worth naming as we close it out. Every one of the 4 threads we walked through tonight, the FBI's statement, Katie's account, the threat reporting, and tomorrow's funeral, represents a different kind of institution or relationship being tested by this case, all at the exact same time. A federal agency forced to explain itself publicly. A young woman forced to become a central witness in a story she never asked to be part of. A family forced to live under active protection from people who wish them harm, simply for their proximity to a tragedy. And a grieving mother and father, forced to bury their son under a level of public scrutiny that almost no family in their position has ever had to endure. Each of those is its own kind of pressure. All four are converging on this family, and on this community, at the exact same moment. It's worth remembering, too, how much this single week actually clarified, even without resolving anything. 2 weeks ago, this case was dominated almost entirely by anonymous claims, viral clips stripped of context, and competing secondhand accounts. This week brought something different, an actual federal agency speaking on the record, a key witness finally heard from directly, rather than through relatives. A level of specificity about threats, about timelines, about process, that simply didn't exist before. None of that adds up to an answer yet, but it is, in real terms, a meaningfully different case than it was even a few days ago. More grounded, more documented, and in some ways, more honest about what it still doesn't know. What comes next, in the most literal sense, is tomorrow morning. A church filling with family, friends, coaches, and teammates. A live stream carrying that same service to strangers across the country. And somewhere behind all of it, an investigation that hasn't paused for a single day of this. Still working through a phone that hasn't yet been jointly examined. 2 autopsies that still haven't produced results. And a contradiction about Nolan's final conversation that even Katie's own direct account hasn't fully resolved. We're going to stay on this story, through tomorrow's funeral, through both autopsy results, and through whatever comes next as this investigation moves toward a grand jury. We'll bring you the facts as we actually get them confirmed, and not a moment before. That's the standard this channel holds itself to on every case we cover, and it's not going to change for this one, no matter how loud the speculation around it gets. If tonight's breakdown helped you actually separate what's confirmed from what's still just reporting in this case, that's exactly what this channel exists to do, and it only works because of you. So here's what I'd ask. If you're not already subscribed, subscribe now, and turn on notifications, because when the autopsy results come in, and they will, we're not going to wait to bring you the facts. Drop your thoughts in the comments below, but I'd ask you to do it with the same care we've tried to bring tonight. This is a real family, living through the worst weeks of their lives in full public view. Share this video with anyone who's been following this case, but hasn't seen the FBI's actual statement or heard about Katie's account directly, because a lot of what's circulating out there right now is still a step or two behind what we just covered. We'll see you back here the moment there's something new and something confirmed to bring you. Rest in the Lord's boss, Psalm, Nolan.